Yeah, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here, to be invited to talk about the chemical safety assessment. What I will try to show you within the next hour is how registrants can efficiently generate and communicate information on safe use of their substance. That was already highlighted yesterday, so that the outcome of the data generation, of the hazard assessment, of the exposure assessment is at the end, how to ensure that substances can be safely used across the life cycle, across the whole life cycle. Just for the introduction, a few key messages, which I will try to underpin a bit during the presentation. So for the registration, the chemical safety assessment is as important as the technical dossier. That means sometimes it seems that the relevance of the CSR is a bit underestimated, but it's as relevant, and you saw from François' presentation that the CSR is also in the area of the manual completeness check now. It's not simple, admittedly, but it's doable. But it's only doable if you take the right approach, communicate with your partners, that means the partners in the supply chain, also have a proper communication with your consultant if you let a consultant do the CSR, and use the right tools. To do it alone without communication with others will never work for a chemical safety assessment. And you need to start in time. Yesterday we had a presentation where it was estimated that it takes 18 weeks. It was in the plan of the Orphan Substance Consortia that it costs 18 weeks to develop exposure scenarios. That means it costs time. So that means starting now would be a good thing, if not already done. Okay, that's the messages. The overview on what I will show to you is a short reminder what a chemical safety assessment is and who is required to perform it. Then to share a bit experience, challenges from the first two registration deadlines, and then to show you approaches and tools for support. This is mainly three things. It's the newly available DNAL calculator in Euclid. It's the sector use maps that were already mentioned yesterday. It's a communication standard, a harmonized communication standard called ESCOM, which is available, and a tool for chemical safety assessment to be used by the registrants. It's called KSAR. It's ECHA's tool for chemical safety assessment and report for registrants. Good. Chemical safety assessment under REACH. What is it? Who is involved? So the first part is to characterize the intrinsic hazards of the substance. And this leads then to classification. I mean, most of you will know this. It leads to the derivation of no effect levels. That means of doses and concentrations where exposure does not cause adverse effects anymore. This is an important information for risk management. And the behavior of the substance. So if it has a low or high vapor pressure, that means if it's to be expected in the air, in the breathing air of workers or not. If it has a high or low water solubility, this all impacts on the exposure. Good. And based on this and use information, that means information on the uses of the substance, the safety assessment then determines the conditions under which the substance can be used safely. Means not only at the registrant side, but also at the formulator side and at the side of the industrial and professional end users, and also when it is entered into articles, for example, like floor coverings, like textiles, then also this life cycle stage need to be covered in the safety assessment. And the outcome of the safety assessment is then, in terms of risk management, to be communicated with the safety data sheets to all the commercial users of the substance, either the substance as such or in mixtures. And so that's the one line of communication later, and the other line of communication is in the chemical safety report. That is part of the registration dossier, and it's also part of the own documentation for product safety in the company. So it contributes, the chemical safety report contributes to the product stewardship approach That means to document the safety of the substance during the use. Okay. Who is required to carry out, to do a full CSA? And when I talk about a full CSA, I mean a CSA with hazard assessment and exposure assessment. First of all, the duty to apply a chemical safety assessment to carry it out is on manufacturers and importers of substances above 10 tons, 10 or more tons, and it does apply to non-intermediates. That means a few of you here in the room will probably not be required to carry out a chemical safety assessment if they only register substances below 10 tons. And then a second criterion is important, where the substance meets the criteria to be classified hazardous or being a PBT, that means being persistent bioaccumulative, then an exposure assessment is required. If the data that have to be generated under REACH show that it's not hazardous, then no exposure assessment is required. But the conclusion, whether one is required or not, is to be based on data. That means that the information requirements in terms of data are fulfilled. The CSR, the exposure assessment, is the duty of each registrant. However, member registrants can delegate it to the lead registrant. That is the joint CSR, where the members say, we delegate the task for the CSR to the lead, and the lead accepts that. There's one prerequisite that this could work. The one was already mentioned, that the substance has the same substance ID profile. That means that it fits into the lead registrant's assessment. And the second is that the use pattern is the same. That means that the member has the same uses as the lead. Then it can work with a full joint CSR. Otherwise, the member may need to do an assessment for certain uses which are not covered by the lead. This, I come to that back later. But in general, joint CSR is foreseen in the legislation as a choice. Good. And the CSR needs to cover all uses of the substance the single registrant is aware of. There's a particular requirement or exception for imported mixtures. For imported mixtures, only the substances above the thresholds of Article 14, which is usually 1% or 0.1%, have to be part of a chemical safety assessment. Good. So that's now saying who is required to do it and how to do it and what's the scope has a lot to do with the market position of an SME registrant. You may know much more about your market position than I do. So that means the cases I list here are only probably a few. There may be others. One is a relatively simple case, low volume registrants of a substance which is already registered and which has no particular special market. There it's relatively easy. They could simply join the existing CSR and that's it. Then there may be companies that manufacture only for one or two other customers. Then they probably get the knowledge on the uses via this customer for whom they are doing that. Then there may be manufacturers, importers of specialties for particular markets. For example, particular additives in industrial coatings. There, it's likely that the knowledge on the conditions of use is available in the own company, because at the end what you develop is a substance for a particular market, for a particular purpose, which means the development already includes knowledge on how it's used. But probably the knowledge sits with your R&D department or with your R&D person or with a salesperson. And then there are registrants of substances for one or more of common downstream user markets. That means substances which are supplied in the normal coatings, adhesives, lubricants, cleaners, construction chemicals. And there, the single registrant may make use of knowledge on the conditions of use that is made available from downstream user sector organizations. I come to that later. That's the so-called use maps, which can be very helpful for single registrants to obtain information on conditions of use. So the challenges and solutions for the CSR may be different depending on the position in the market. So typical assessment questions. I mean, just a list of typical questions that should be answered during an assessment. First question, very basic but extremely important. Is the substance in general suitable to be widely used by untrained workers in small business and by consumers? There may be substances where you probably would like to see it only used by trained workers and not by consumers. Then this needs to be very clearly stated in the CSR and also later in the safety data sheet. Then question, which types of exposure controls at workplace are needed to handle the substance safely? And there you would distinguish between industrial workplaces and non-industrial workplaces. Typical question to be answered in the CSR: what are the conditions? Ventilation conditions, personal protection equipment, closed systems, all that questions. Then, how much of a substance can be used per day at an industrial site without on-site pre-treatment of wastewater? Also a very typical question you would handle in your assessment, saying up to, let's say, 10 tons, this substance can be used at an industrial site without the user of this substance need to do particular on-site measures on the environment side. And then the last questions refer, for example, to consumer products. Consumer products, you would not really have risk management advice for consumers. For consumers, in principle, the goal is that the product is inherently safe. So the question is now, what makes a product, a consumer product, inherently safe? The one thing is, of course, maximum concentrations. You can say from the assessment, this substance should not be higher than this and this percentage in the product. And then the formulator can see whether this fits to his product design or not. Or the amount of mixture per package, small packages, should not be larger than this and this. Also, particular package designs can be useful for corrosive substances, for example. And for articles, again, toys, textiles, it's again the question whether a substance is suitable for particular articles, and it can be on concentration. So just on one slide, typical key questions to be answered in a chemical safety assessment. Good. Now the question how to do it. There is a general workflow. Most elements of this workflow, I have already mentioned that, already introduced. So it's now just giving you again an overview on how the things play together. It's the substance properties. That's the hazard assessment. And on the other side, it's the exposure estimates. That means which concentrations, doses occur on use. Again, for this you need substance properties, how it distributes in the environment, how volatile it is. And then what you need for this is the uses. That means in which uses does it occur, and what's the conditions under which it's used. If this is information available, you can do an exposure assessment, an exposure estimate, and then you compare the hazard thresholds with the exposure, and then you conclude, or your consultant concludes, risk controlled. That means everything is fine under the conditions as appearing in the market at the moment, or not controlled. Then the assessment needs to be iterated. That means either you need to improve the information, or you need to limit the uses, or you need to suggest additional risk management measures. So the outcome of the whole thing is the chemical safety report, I mentioned that already, the exposure scenarios for communication into the market with a safety data sheet, and also uses advised against, communicated with a safety data sheet. What we observe is at the moment that quite a number of registrants from the early deadlines switch to use this element in the safety data sheet or in the exposure scenarios, use advised against. That means clearly saying this substance should not go to consumer products, or this substance should not be used by untrained workers, to be explicit on this. Good. The key challenge in this all is that to carry out in a safety assessment, you need to bring together information. The manufacturer hopefully knows everything about the properties of the substance, and the customer, the downstream users, know hopefully everything about how the substance is used. And the challenge is how to bring this information together. That means communication in the supply chain is the key thing for carrying out a safety assessment. And it's not only communicating the risk advice down the chain, but also obtaining information on the uses and conditions up the chain. Good. This was already shown by Christian yesterday, the different levels of the life cycle and the different actors in this. I skipped this. You saw that. This is in principle the same, but in a workflow or in a communication flow. So the process in principle starts with information generated downstream, that means at formulators level or at end users level. What are the existing users? That means what are the customer groups and under which conditions take the use place. This information goes to the registrants. The registrants do their assessment on this and then they communicate it down to the single downstream user, the conditions of use, and at the same time they file the information to ECHA and the member states via the registration dossiers, and the information is disseminated, the non-confidential information is disseminated via our website to the public. That's the basic scheme, and I will come back to the scheme in later slides. The legal requirements on this, the information on uses and conditions of use may be provided by downstream users to registrants. That was already mentioned yesterday. The exposure scenarios communicated from the registrants to the downstream users are to be followed. That means there's an obligation of the downstream user to follow the advice unless they take the decision to do their own assessment, to document their own assessment and to notify the fact that they have carried out an own assessment, to notify this to ECHA. So that means this is the mechanism foreseen in REACH to have the assessments carried out by registrants also in a realistic way and to allocate clear responsibility. So either the registrant does the assessment or the downstream user, and not keeping in a gray zone who has done the assessment. Good experience so far from the first registration deadline. Some of this was already mentioned. Some of the experience you may have made yourself. The derivation of the no effect levels for the substance, we see this in the registration dossiers, is relatively often intransparent or even wrong. And if this is wrong, then it may lead to inappropriate risk management. That can be on both sides. It can be too stringent risk management measures or too loose risk management measures. Then, what Crystal mentioned already yesterday, registrants have included all potential users they could think of into their registration. And there's a lack of use-specific amount. So, if we as a registrants, if we as the authorities see this information, and we can't see the real uses and their extent because they are unclear or wrong, then we probably may take wrong decisions on further regulatory risk management. If we see there is a substance, a relatively nasty substance, going to consumer users without any tonnage information, we assign in our priority setting system the whole manufacturing tonnage to this use. And you can imagine that this means this substance ranks then very high in our priorities, which would be a wrong priority setting. But it's based on the fact that we can't understand from the dossier what is done with the substance. Then, advice on safe use is often too generic or too unrealistic to be helpful to users of chemicals. So having exposure scenarios sent to professional users of a substance that the substance should be handled in closed systems is simply not helpful and it doesn't work. Or having something very generic also doesn't help. Registrants from the first deadlines have often copied, pasted the exposure scenarios from the CSR into the safety data sheets, which lead then to the 100, 200, 400 or 500 pages of safety data sheet annexes. This is something which does not work because the exposure scenario for communication is something for communicating with users, also with SME users. It's not made for the authorities. It's really made for users of chemicals, including small companies, to understand it and to find themselves, and you will not find yourself within 500 pages. Then what is still very often done is manual transfer of the data from one document to another. That means the registrant have their safety data, a safety report, and then they copy the data into their safety data sheet system, and in the next level, the data are copied again, which is a bit inefficient, and there's a high likelihood for mistakes. And it's not really modern anymore. And the registrants, which we also see, have not planned CSR updates. That means they had made a contract within the consortium with the consultant to do it once, and that's it. And have done it in Word documents. And are now confronted with the question how they should update their CSR with upcoming new information. Good. Potential consequences for the business of the shortcomings. Customers complain about wrong or unhelpful safety data sheets. Or, this I mentioned already, authorities pick the substance for further regulatory actions for the wrong reason, simply because they base their decision on the information provided by the registrant. Or, the registration dossier is incompliant due to inconsistencies between Euclid, the CSR, and the safety data sheet. The legislation is relatively explicit on this. The information needs to be consistent across all these documents. And the maintenance and update of the registration dossier is burdensome and costly. I also mentioned that. However, there are solutions available to reduce these business risks. And I would switch now in the next part of my presentation to these tools. But I would like, before, whether anything on the requirements regarding the safety assessment is not understood, or whether you have questions on that. So what are the requirements, what you have to do, and when you have to do it? Are there any questions at the moment where I was unclear or where the legislation is unclear? Then you could ask this now, before coming to the tools.
Thank you. I'm always Guido Lena from UEAPME. My question is very basic. All this communication up and down the supply chain with these safety data sheets, and in what language should normally happen? Because that could also be a problem, no? I guess, if you don't understand each other. So if you have a company in Italy and the other one in Finland and the other one in
It's the national languages.
Okay,
it's the national languages. That means it's the source document we receive usually is the CSR. We receive this in English. It makes sense to develop the exposure scenarios for communication in English. There is standard phrases available for this in English. And then the next step is, for those placing it on the market in one of the member states, it needs to be a national language.
So yes, it has to be translated.
Yes.
And who's translated? The companies at national level?
In principle, this is a service in the market where companies offer, which are working in the safety data sheet business, to do translations. Mm-hmm. It's a business.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. If there are no further questions at this, okay.
Ada Radon, Sixth Circle K, Norway. I just wanted to ask you in regards to the quality of exposure scenarios. We have received an alert from the local authorities that there will be an upcoming audit on the quality of the exposure scenarios, and this is something that is being requested by ECHA. And I just wanted to ask, what are your expectations or inquiry requirements for the quality of exposure scenarios for downstream users? Thank you.
For the first part, I have not acoustically fully understood. What have you been made aware of?
The local authorities, as I'm coming from Norway, that is the Norwegian Environmental Agency, they have sent us an email with information that there will be an inspection or an audit.
Okay.
Yes.
Understood what you mean now. So to your first part of the question, there is an activity launched by the member states via the forum. The forum is a committee at ECHA, where the member states coordinate their work in terms of enforcement. And there is this year an enforcement campaign called REF5. That's the abbreviation for Reach Enforcement Project number 5. So you can see for that there were already 4 others. But the 5 concentrates on exposure scenarios in safety data sheets. And the inspections are foreseen to take place at the registrants level. That means the safety data sheets which are supplied in the market, and then at formulators level and at end users level. This is an action by the member states. So we have not ordered the member states to do this. We can't do this. That's a decision by the member states. But we help the member states with this. And in particular, we try to help the inspectors in getting a reference exposure scenario for communication from us, which we have extracted from the dossier. So we take at the moment the registrants dossiers, extract the information which is relevant for exposure scenario for communication, and try to develop an exposure scenario for communication for a substance which is as concise as possible, that the inspectors can use that as a comparison for the exposure scenarios they find in the market. And I have to say, the whole project is not on quality. The question, it's on presence. So is an exposure scenario available? And does it address all the areas that should be addressed based on the substance properties? But it does not go into the question, is it helpful or not? That is very difficult, would be very difficult at the moment for inspectors to decide in an enforcement project whether an exposure scenario is helpful or not. So that's why, just is it there? Is it more or less complete? And does it differentiate the activities carried out by a worker or by a consumer or regarding the environment? So we follow this a bit distant. We are in dialogue with the national coordinators, but we don't run this. Good. Then I would go to the tools now. Okay? Yes. So the DNL-PNL calculator. The DNL calculator, that means the calculator for the human health thresholds, is available in the current Euclid. That means based on the substance property, on the testing results and other information in Euclid, Euclid calculates a DNL based on the procedures, that means on the safety factor, on the assessment factors as foreseen in the guidance, and then a result comes out, which is done in Euclid. It's mainly at the moment for the long-term systemic toxicity, and it's explained in the registration manual section 9761. You see also the link there to the ECHA website. Important to say, the DNL calculator is mainly for making the DNL calculation transparent. You can still deviate from the foreseen route, but then the justifications need to be transparent and needs to be clear. So it helps transparency, and it will also help us to see where the DNLs are probably problematic. And the same thing is developed it will be in the next Euclid release for environmental thresholds. Good. Second tool. Tools to help communication in the supply chain. You saw this scheme already. It's now populated with tools. I start again where I started in the scheme before, left hand. The use maps are expected to be developed by downstream user organizations. What are the users relevant in the sector, under which conditions? They go to the registrants. These use maps are structured information in harmonized formats. I come to that a bit later. Registrants can upload them directly into KSAR, that means into their assessment tool. They carry then out the assessment with the data, the substance data from Euclid. And then the registrant generates an exposure scenario for communication on this. There are two formats for an exposure scenario for communication. The one is on substances, so 2 harmonized formats. The one is for substances, and the other that has been developed, which is then used by formulators, is the safe use information for mixtures. So 2 harmonized formats. And a communication standard. That means phrases. That's the so-called ESCOM, Exposure Scenario Communication. It's the ESCOM. It's a phrase catalog, which is regularly updated. CEFIC is responsible for CEFIC, and DUC has now recently joined. So the downstream user associations have joined the steering group on this. So it runs under the responsibility of industry, a phrase catalog, which is regularly updated, and an exchange standard, an XML exchange standard, so that the information can be transferred by IT systems, and that the manual transfer of information from one dossier to the other, from one document to the other, can be minimized. And this is then the information the individual downstream user receives. The use map elements, you find empty templates. If you yourself want to develop use maps, so the templates are also useful if you're a registrant which has only a limited number of customers and you want to collect the information in a structured, harmonized format. Then these templates can also be used. It's very useful, even if no downstream user sector organization is in this. So it's 4 templates. It's the use description. It's the information for worker exposure, called SWETs, sector-specific worker exposure description. Then for consumers, the SCETs, specific consumer exposure determinants, and for environment you have the same. This is empty templates which can be filled, but where the templates are made in a way that the information can be directly used in the registrant's assessment. Good. What I forgot is there is 5 use maps with this information have been published, and these use map information is available on ECHA's website. We have an agreement with the downstream user organizations that they can publish their use map information via our website. So there's one single point of access, and we know of quite a number of other downstream user organizations who prepare their use map at the moment. What is published is for cleaners, for construction chemicals, cosmetics, ink, printing and ink, and the coatings is in preparation, and the construction chemicals is published. Good. Then, that was mentioned yesterday, the chemical safety report and exposure scenario roadmap. You see on this slide a number of links to our website. So there is a common program available. That's the so-called roadmap, where a group so it's based on cooperation with CEFIC, Eurometaux, CONCAVE, and DUC, and the member state authorities. So it's a cross-stakeholder initiative who works under a plan. That's the roadmap. There's a suite of tools available, and there is a joint statement from last October by CEFIC and DUC and ECHA that use maps are a key tool and should be used by everyone, generated and used by everyone to make life for everyone easier. And there's information on the exchange network on exposure scenarios. There are meetings twice a year. Approximately 300 people working in this network, from formulating sector, from registrant sector, from member states. Good. The use map concept, I think I skipped this slide at the moment. It's just describing what I said before with the scheme. So if you supply as a registrant in a market of common formulation, then it's useful to request downstream users to do use maps. It's an effective way to get representative information on users. It helps downstream users to make sure that their typical use are covered in the registration dossier. So it's also something for the downstream users sitting here in the room. Provide structured information in a comprehensible information, allowing registrants to carry out a chemical safety assessment in an efficient way. And it helps registrants to be realistic in their safety assessment, because they start from information on what really happens in the market and doesn't invent anything when they are sitting in front of their assessment and it doesn't get green. and then in the assessments in 2010, there were a lot of inventions registrant made to get their risk controlled, regardless of whether this was realistic or not. And use maps can prevent this. So you start as a registrant from information where the downstream users say, yeah, this is how we handle the stuff. And the use maps even foresee that the phrases in which downstream users would like to receive this information are already assigned. So that means also the language is then better for downstream user to understand it. It's more helpful for authorities to get a clear view on what the use is. It increases the consistency across assessments. So let's say you have for a coating, you have probably 7, 8 functional elements and probably 50 raw materials. And if all the registrants of these raw materials refer to the same use map, this is much more helpful than having 100 suppliers that all use different ways of communicating the safe use advice in the supply chain. I mean, it's obvious. I probably even do not need to state it. But interestingly, this is how it works at the moment. Good. That's about the use map. KSAR, ECHA's tool for registrants for carrying out the chemical safety assessment and reporting. KSAR is a web application. It's for registrant to carry out the safety assessment, to generate the safety report, and to generate the exposure scenarios for communication. That means all what I said before, this tool can do. And it supports the generation of information useful for screening of substance by authorities via exporting the data to Euclid. So that means KSAR can export the information on use and exposure to Euclid. So we can see then in the Euclid dossier that you have described the use and the conditions of use in a way that we are confident, based on what we can see, that the risks are low. So we don't pick your substance if it's done in a right way. It's released as a standalone version already in the distributed version in May 2010 for the first time. That means we are now more than 6 years later. That means in the current version, which was released in December 2016, a lot of experience and testing has already been included. That means the application is now quite stable, IT-wise and also content-wise, from the workflow and from the assessment features. So the data flow on this, it's now again a bit different representation of what you saw before. You have KSAR as a central tool, and KSAR can upload information from use maps from the ECHA website. Then in KSAR, there are certain exposure estimation tools which can be run to generate exposure estimates. You can also connect external tools to KSAR by different means. Then the information is assessed, and then the outputs are produced in terms of export to Euclid and export into the safety data sheet systems. What I need to say before is, for the chemical safety assessment, you need the substance properties, you need the denotes, you need the PNEX, you need the classification. This all can be loaded into KSAR from Euclid. That means KSAR can directly upload the information. It selects automatically the information needed for the assessment from Euclid with one click. Good. And then it goes via the Euclid to ECHA's database, and from there to ECHA member state assessment and to the public via dissemination, as long as it's not confidential. KSAR is organized in a number of boxes, as we call them, or you can also call them blocks of functionalities. It's all around substance properties, importing the substance from Euclid, and then defining, based on the substance properties, which kind of assessments needs to be carried out. The second is the description of uses in a life cycle, in standard life cycle structure. The third is the exposure assessment. That means exposure scenario generation, exposure estimates. The fourth is the generation of the chemical safety report. The fifth is the extended safety data, the exposure scenario for the extended safety data sheet. The sixth is probably the heart of KSAR. That's the library, where all the assessment elements which can be useful are stored. That means each registrant has the possibility to reuse assessment elements he has already generated for previous assessment. It's the part where the standard phrase catalog is stored and can be regularly updated based on an upload from the CEFIC website. This is where you can, once you don't find conditions of use in a use map, you define it once for your market, and then you use it for all the assessments. So that's the library, and then there's a bit on users management. Good, the workflow, I click that very quickly through. It's nothing else than what you saw before in the simple workflow. It's just that KESAR, in principle, implements the workflow for a standard chemical safety assessment in a guided workflow. And in this way, it integrates the set of guidance documents on chemical safety assessment, which was yesterday called Be Complex. I think it's complex. But all these guidance documents are, in principle, incorporated into KESAR, and there's, like François explained for Euclid, there's a help system internally which explains at the certain steps what to be done. But a lot is done by the tool for you, and you only need to confirm that the tool did it in the right way. Good, and you can import use maps in this workflow. Then it goes to the quantitative exposure assessment, and then at the end, the CSR comes out and the export of users and exposure data to Euclid. Good. I skip this one. This is a different workflow, and come to the conclusion from my presentation. So regarding the CSA as such, the use and the use condition exposure information obtained via the chemical safety assessment process is useful or is needed for supporting safe use. And I would like to emphasize something. This is mainly about supporting safe use by self-sustained mechanisms. Crystal called that yesterday the first level of risk management. And the first level of risk management is meant under REACH to be done by industry itself. That means registrants and downstream users in cooperation with each other. And only where this does not work, authorities intervene. And this system which I introduced to you is meant to support in an efficient way a self-sustained system. And it also can be used by authorities to identify gaps, information gaps, and to prioritize and also to deprioritize. So where we receive good information, the likelihood that its substance goes into regulatory action is low. But we need to understand and we need to be convinced by your information. KESAR provides the opportunity, and this is now particular on KESAR, for consistency within the chemical safety assessment between substance properties, exposure information, then information for the authorities and for the supply chain, so that the dossier we have and what is communicated in the market is consistent to each other and does not start its life on its own, and after 5 years it doesn't fit to each other anymore. KESAR provides opportunities for standardization. This is and this can be divided in two: efficiency gains for all actors, that means a systematic workflow. Import, export, printed formats of use maps can be done. And efficiency in single assessments. That means it integrates exposure tools. You can reuse information across substances. It automatically generates documents, and it facilitates updates, since it's a database format. Good. In my last slide, what I would like to mention, I forgot this, that we, and probably this is done for later discussion, with the release, so after the release, around the release of KESAR 3, we started a training program for KESAR. We had a first training in October with 30 participants. We had a next one in February. We will have a next one in April, and we will have a next one in June. What we see at the moment is that more and more companies switch to KESAR, consultants and registrants, and where we have overall a relatively high demand for these trainings. And so we are relatively sure that there will be further training sessions across 2017. And if you're interested, you can flag your interest via an email to us, via our website, or also give me your name, and then I take it home. Good. Last 2 slides. We have a practical guide for SME managers that was already mentioned yesterday, for SME managers and REACH coordinators. And there is 7 pages in it on chemical safety assessment. It's page 123 to 130. And I will conclude my presentation just with a few tips which are in this practical guide. So the first one is utilize information from sector use maps. If sector use maps available, use them if you need to do a chemical safety assessment. Search for in-house information. Usually, and probably in smaller companies, this is even more easy than in big companies. Usually, product development and technical department knows something about the use conditions and knows something about the composition of the substance. Usually, marketing and sales department also knows something about the use conditions and the uses. Very important, do not compromise your obligations to provide downstream users with useful safety data sheets, including exposure scenarios for communication, which really help to ensure. So it's not a formality to have these exposure scenarios. They are meant to help your customers. Ensure that the chemical safety report is understandable for an outside reader. We made even the experience with a number of industry colleagues when going back to their reports that they could not understand anymore what their own colleagues had written in the chemical safety reports. So this is very important. It needs to be understandable for an outside reader, and it does not contain elements that are not relevant or even wrong. That means a chemical safety report, the quality decreases with its volume. You need to agree with your co-registrants whether you want to create one joint CSR that fits all members in a SIF or in a consortium. And for this, it's very important that you find a mechanism to see whether all member users are covered by the joint CSR or not. And this, of course, includes elements of confidentiality and elements of markets. That means you may need a third party for this. If you opt for a joint CSR, you may even also develop the content of the safety data sheet with your co-registrants. That would have, it's not done by many consortia so far, but it has a huge advantage. All users of the substance, regardless on whether who places it on the market, get the same information from their suppliers. And consider developing a structured system for your downstream users to provide feedback on exposure scenarios you send to them, so that this is not phone calls, emails which can't be found back, but that there is a structured system for feedback. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Andreas.